The Civil Rights era of 1960s, which led to the advancement of social, political, and economic rights for the African Americans, is often attributed to the actions of people like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and Stokely Carmichael, or to the presidents like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. Little attention has been given to President Dwight D. Eisenhower's role. Traditionally, historians who have written about Eisenhower focus more on his dealings with the Cold War and minimize his role in civil rights by emphasizing his lack of attention to better the conditions for African Americans in the 1950s. Therefore, anyone reading about Eisenhower and the civil rights movement would probably come to the conclusion that the 34th president's contribution to the civil rights era was almost non-existent, and attribute any gains made by African Americans to the presidents like JFK and LBJ. However, some assumptions would be incorrect because Eisenhower did indeed take a stand when it came to the civil rights for African Americans. Despite being a man of his times, he ensured the desegregation of the military and the nation's capital. He appointed liberal judges and enforced their ruling, and he passed civil rights legislation that created a commission on civil rights. Eisenhower was born in 1890 in Denison, Texas, a state that 25 years before had slavery and was part of the Confederacy during the Civil War. His parents then moved him to Abilene, Kansas, where he grew up among mostly white people. He grew up poor and he had to work in a creamery as a young man to help pay for his brother's education. In 1911, he was accepted into West Point Academy and graduated in 1915. A year later, he married Mamie Geneva Dowd, whom he had two sons with, one which died at 3 years of age. For the next 30 years, Eisenhower moved around a great deal and lived in places like Georgia, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. During this time, he worked his way up the ranks in the segregated military. In 1942, he became the Major General and Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces in World War II, where he led Operation Torch and the invasion of North Africa. After the war, he became the president of Columbia University and later was convinced to run for the presidency even though he did not like politics. In 1953, he became the 34th President of the United States. Although Eisenhower never associated much with African Americans and he grew up during a time when African Americans lived with Jim Crow laws, prejudice, and discrimination, he never showed any apparent racism towards them. In college, while his teammates refused to play against African Americans, Eisenhower usually took their places. Throughout his years in the military, he served in segregated units, but when he was a general, he did not hesitate to use African American soldiers where they were needed. Furthermore, although he did not question segregation, he did believe in equality under the law for all. President Eisenhower is often criticized for not fighting against the status quo in the South. However, if he hesitated to take action, it was because he thought it was impossible to force a prejudice out of the white Southerns, and that changes for African Americans would happen slowly on their own. You cannot change people's hearts merely by the laws, was what he often said about desegregation in the South. Despite his hesitation, Eisenhower did take some action to improve civil rights for African Americans. Even though President Harry S. Truman passed Executive Order 9981 to desegregate the military, it was Eisenhower who saw it through to the end, and he even made this an issue in his 1952 campaign for president. He was determined to have discrimination eliminated from the military, and in 1954, the last segregated unit disappeared. At the same time, Eisenhower also ordered the Justice Department to desegregate the nation's capital. Washington, D.C. desegregated their restaurants and their theaters and opened hotel rooms to African Americans. Eisenhower also issued an executive order to eliminate discrimination in federal contracts. Furthermore, in 1955, he appointed E. Frederick Moore as the first African American executive assistant to the White House. After 1954, however, Eisenhower could no longer expect the status quo in the South to continue because African Americans were determined to gain equality under the law. After the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African American killed by two white men after he supposedly whistled at a white woman, the outcry for justice and civil rights for African Americans grew even louder. Through protests and the courts, African Americans fought for all the rights they deserved as citizens of the country. They declared that all men are created equal. That same year, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was appointed by Eisenhower, ruled in the court case Brown v. Board of Education. This ruling overturned the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which set up separate but equal. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus, and this led to the Montgomery bus boycott, and in 1956, the Supreme Court declared segregation on buses unconstitutional. However, it was an incident in Arkansas in 1957 that led Eisenhower to take some more meaningful action against segregation in the South. That year, Governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, stood at the doors of Little Rock, Arkansas High School to stop the segregation by blocking 9 black students from attending classes. Even though the president believed that states should handle things locally, Eisenhower was forced to take action against Faubus and sent the National Guard to escort those 9 African American students to school, and they did so for over a year. Before doing so, he did address the American public and explain his actions thoroughly, and stating that he was doing so to uphold the Constitution of the United States.
Extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights. If resistance to the federal court order ceases at once, the further presence of federal troops will be unnecessary, and a blot upon the fair name and high honor of our nation in the world will be removed. Mob rule can not be allowed to override the decisions of our courts.
That same year, Eisenhower passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first passed by a president since Reconstruction. It created a civil rights section in the Justice Department to ensure African Americans' voting rights. It also set up the Commission on Civil Rights, which would investigate wrongdoing in elections, and that the policies of the federal government provided equal protection of law under the Constitution. Not many people remember this 1950s law and focus more on those of the 1960s. Even Eisenhower himself was aware of how little credit he got for advancing African American rights. He believed that historians mostly wanted to prove that it was someone else who did this and he was just along for the ride. Whether by force or circumstances, Eisenhower did take action to help obtain civil rights for African Americans. He first saw that the military was desegregated and then did the same in Washington, D.C. He appointed the first African American to his administration and liberal judges who supported civil rights. When the court ruled against segregation, he made sure that the Constitution was upheld. More importantly, he was the first president since the late 1800s to pass any kind of civil rights law. All this set a path for the civil rights laws of the 1960s. In the end, it does not matter why President Eisenhower did it. The most important thing to remember is that he did take a stand for civil rights, and he opened the path for presidents after him to pass more laws that would bring African Americans closer to enjoying all the rights they were entitled to as citizens of the United States of America.